Good afternoon. We're so happy to be here. This is 760 KGU AM, part of the Wall Street Business Network. Today we're going to talk about the Jones Act. What is it and whether it's helping us? And for this discussion, we have two spectacular experts in the Jones Act. One is Mike Hansen, who's the president of the Shippers Council, and you've seen him in the paper. He writes op-eds on the subject from time to time. And Jay Friedham, who is an admiralty attorney and has been sailing that channel for quite some years. He brings with him today a beard that looks like Santa Claus and a fantastic hat that he tells me is a yarmulke. And Jay, I know what a yarmulke is, but thank you.
Good.
So say hello.
Jay Friedham, I've been doing this for about 25 years. I went to school at Tulane in New Orleans, which is the premier Admiralty and Maritime Law Academy in the world, actually. And that's where I got my start in this, and I came here to practice maritime law, initially helping ship owners, and now I help injured workers, mostly the people who load and unload vessels.
That's part of the Jones Act we have to talk about.
And I know that's not the part that gets the most emphasis.
No, but we have to talk about it. So, Mike, give you a little précis of your background, too.
Yeah, I'm Mike Hansen. I'm with Hawaii Shippers Council. I've been in the maritime industry since the early 1970s here in Hawaii, with various different firms and businesses of my own.
Okay. And one of the reasons we want to talk about this is that tomorrow, ThinkTech, the Hawaii Venture Capital Association, Hawaii Business Magazine, Pacific New Media at the university are all coming together for a program, our monthly program at the Plaza Club. Begins at 11:30 in the morning, and it's, who's keeping up with the Jones Act? There's a hesitation in there. Who's keeping up with the Jones Act? You got that? You guys, you got that. And is it helping Hawaii? How does it affect us economically? There's so many arguments, and in political season, you get arguments that maybe, we ought to talk about those arguments on validity. So the first thing I'd like to do, and so that's tomorrow. If you want to sign up for that, it's HVCA, that's Hawaii Venture Capital Association.org. And we'll be there. We'll have a very interesting discussion, I promise you that. So today, just in the way of warming up for that, let me just ask Mike about some of the most recent events that have struck the news on this, where this has come up. We have about, Mike could probably do this in 2 hours, but we have about 7 minutes.
Sure. One of the most recent stories to come out in the Jones Act is to do with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve on the Gulf Coast and whether or not President Obama will release crude oil supplies from that reserve and whether or not he will issue waivers so that foreign flag crude oil tankers can be used to transport that from the Gulf Coast to refineries in the Mid-Atlantic and New England region. And this is a major issue. On one side, he's got the maritime unions and the maritime industry who are supporters of his and the Democratic Party. And on the other side, he's got his consumers in the Mid-Atlantic and New England region who are facing a possible shortage of gasoline and diesel fuel in the fall. And if he doesn't provide them with enough fuel, he may not get the votes he needs to.
It's all about votes. Everything is all about votes.
So it's which side is he going to favor in this issue?
Okay, LNG, real quick. LNG, you wrote an op-ed piece in April, I want to say April 29th about this, and you pointed out that it was very hard for gas company or anybody else to get a tanker together to transport LNG from the West Coast, where it is in plentiful supply, to Hawaii. This is going to have an effect. So what about the implication of the Jones Act on LNG?
Right. LNG is liquefied natural gas, and it's available on certain places on the North American West Coast. And to bring it in shipload quantities, there haven't been any LNG carriers built in the United States since the 1970s. There are none in the Jones Act fleet. Constructing one at a U.S. shipyard would cost a very large amount of money, probably be not feasible. So
okay.
The question is, will the government allow foreign-built LNG carriers to be brought under the U.S. flag and given what's known as coast-wise or domestic privileges to operate between two U.S. ports carrying cargo.
Okay, this is going to have an effect on Hawaii ultimately because the cost of shipping it the way they now contemplate, short of a tanker, is by small containers in a Matson, container.
What they're talking about shipping is in a refrigerated tank container.
Right.
And these are very expensive, very high-tech tank containers that have to take the temperature down very low, below 200 degrees Fahrenheit, I believe it is. I mean, and they have
negative, minus.
Minus, yeah. And they have to be able to withstand the extreme pressure in the event the refrigeration unit failed. So it's a high-tech piece of equipment.
Yes, it is, and it's going to have an effect on energy because the difference between LNG that's transported in these Matson containers, refrigerated containers, versus a tanker ship, which also has to be refrigerated.
Right.
If it's in liquid form, it has to be way cold.
An LNG carrier is refrigerated.
Yeah.
Now,
the Koreans could make them. They could make them tomorrow.
They are building them right now.
Yeah.
The South Koreans.
But not for us.
No, because that's not allowed by the Jones Act.
Yeah.
It has to be a U.S. built ship in order to qualify under the Jones Act.
Those are the parameters. It has to be U.S. built, U.S. flagged,
U.S. crew,
and
and
U.S. owned.
Right.
I got that on 4 fingers in my hand. I may never forget.
That's what's known as cabotage or cabotage.
How did that start with the cabotage?
Well, it turns out if you look at the history of the world and the civilizations, go back to the Phoenicians.
This is like a Mel Brooks movie. Go ahead.
Every nation, the cabotage means to protect your coastwise trade. Every nation historically that did not protect its coastwise trade is no longer around. It's a recognized, necessary component of national security. As soon as you're vulnerable to foreign control of your shipping, your ability to conduct trade, your ability to defend your country goes way down and you disappear. So cabotage is more than just about creating union jobs or guaranteeing better benefits. It's a well-recognized historical national security issue, and that's really what's behind the Jones Act.
Maybe a condition of humanity, even nation against nation somehow.
Right.
Goes deep.
Yeah, cabotage is carriage between the capes.
Carriage between the capes?
Capes,
Oh,
cabotage.
I didn't know that.
Cabo, as in Cabo San Lucas, cape.
Here's what's important.
But the issue here with the U.S. Jones Act is it's a very restrictive form of cabotage. No other country in the world has as restrictive a form of cabotage, and this is why this regime in the United States is sometimes referred to as super cabotage.
Okay, I don't quite agree with that, but I'd like to explain.
Please.
I actually find that our cabotage laws could be tweaked and tightened up to the protection of our country and to the benefit of local shippers and shipping costs. Mm-hmm. Here's the big deal. Most nations are contiguous. In the United States, Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, and Guam, but particularly Hawaii and Alaska, are non-contiguous states. So the burden placed upon us by the Jones Act is much higher, and perhaps that's where we need help. Likewise, in Alaska, I just came back from Alaska yesterday where they're talking about the Jones Act also. Mm-hmm. In Alaska, you can bring things up by truck, by rail, and by plane. In Hawaii, we've only got boats and we've got airplanes, and you can't bring the kind of cargo in that we need on airplanes. We are dependent on vessels. It's the nature of us being a non-connected state that makes it seem so oppressive in Hawaii.
Okay, so do we agree on that? That Hawaii has a situation which is different than all other states?
Not that. Well, that statement wouldn't be true. If you take the non-contiguous jurisdictions, Alaska, Guam, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico,
okay,
who are encompassed by the coastwise laws of the United States,
yes,
we are all similarly disadvantaged.
Okay, so those kinds of places all have a severe effect from the Jones Act.
That's correct.
Okay, so the next question is that effect so damaging, okay, that we have to stand up and speak out on the subject and get it changed for us?
The biggest single problem facing us with the Jones Act is the fact that we've had an almost complete decline of the major U.S. shipbuilding industry. And this is where our problem is. For example, in the non-contiguous container trades, the container ships are averaging 28 years. Most container ships in the world are retired somewhere between 18 and 20 years. We're operating an aging fleet of container ships. Horizon Lines
So it's not working.
That's right.
By the way, that's the voice of Mike Hansen. And he's here in the studio, I guess you could say studio. This is really our video studio where we videotape and broadcast on the radio. And you can call us at 296-5467, and you can talk to Mike Hansen or Jay Friedham right after this short break. We're talking about the Jones Act. What is it, and is it helping Hawaii? We'll be right back. Stay there. Serious. See, I wasn't kidding. We're really on the radio. We're really on the radio. So, okay, so you want to do more news, or you want to get into, exactly how it works? I'm thinking at this point we ought to go to exactly how it works, and we can weave the news in.
Sure.
And this is being recorded too. This is part of our video program, what we say now. So if you have any expletives that that come to mind, delete them.
Yeah.
So how was your trip back from Alaska, Jay?
Tiring. It's a long way.
Yeah. How do you come by? Way the West Coast?
No,
Northwest?
it's a direct flight, but it's still a hefty flight. That's part of the you realize just how isolated we are, Bay. The closest place you can get to is 2,300 miles away.
Yeah. And would that be Alaska or the West Coast?
I think that would be L.A.
Yeah. Interesting.
That's one of the things when you're flying into another city along the shore. As you're landing, you see warehouses everywhere. You don't see that here, and do you get the impact of that? I mean, because of that, we're constantly dependent upon the movement of cargo and the movement of trade.
Yeah,
We can't store and supply
it's
things.
just in time.
It's just in time. Yeah.
But, people don't realize that we are isolated by water. I don't think they understand it. They
Well,
don't get to the beach much. They don't look at the ships out there. They have no contact with the harbor.
Most people have no idea how things get on the shelf.
Right.
Yeah.
It's cargo cult. It's modern day cargo cult.
We're the most remote island group in the world. There's
Most
nobody-
remote island group in the world, yeah.
The most remote. I mean, these are geographic factors that sort of come together into a perfect storm for the person shopping at Safeway. It's,
Okay, well, we have a most interesting situation here because as time goes by, one thing and another, there'll be more pressure on us. Coming back now. We're back. We're back with Mike Hansen and Jay Friedham. We're talking about the Jones Act. What is it, and is it helping Hawaii? So I'd like to move to the discussion of exactly, how did this act get started? What was it originally intended? And I warn you, the question is, were those circumstances at one time, are they the same today, or maybe has the Jones Act gotten a little stale, gentlemen? But let's talk about its origin.
Yeah, the origins of the Jones Act are misunderstood by most people. Wesley Jones, the man who introduced the Jones Act as senator from the state of Washington into the Congress, introduced the Jones Act for the purpose of excluding Canadian ship owners and merchants from the Alaska trade and reserving that trade for his constituents in the Seattle business community. So it was intended as a purely protectionist commercial legislation.
Is this a wonderful country or what?
In its initial inception, and this is well known in Alaska. James Michener wrote about it in his book Alaska, and Wally Hinkle wrote about it. He's the former governor of Alaska, and in fact, the Territory of Alaska in 1921 sued the United States to try and overturn the Jones Act because they said it was in contravention of the Commerce Clause in the United States. And the Supreme Court of the United States told them that they didn't count because they were a territory.
So Jay, you talk about preserving the the national integrity, preserving our merchant marine and all that, but it comes in a funny way, doesn't it? It wasn't really like that then.
If you buy into his analysis of it,
okay.
that's certainly a way you could view it. But I prefer to look at it as the United States, when we separated from England, we adopted into our laws the laws that had been developed in England over many centuries. And if you look at the history of the court system in England, there was the King's Court that dealt with criminal acts. There was the Court of the Church called Equity, which dealt with inheritance and fairness, adoptions and marriages and things. And then there was the Court of Admiralty. It was so important to the trade of England that they realized you could not leave it to the church or the state to determine how a shipper was going to be treated when they came into your ports. Because if they were treated poorly, they would not come to your ports. Your workers could not produce things that went out into international trade. That's why Admiralty courts were separate than the courts of equity and law. In the United States, we merged that. But first, we took in all those laws. And the history of the laws of England had to do with the humane treatment of sailors. It was very clear that if you did not take care of these sailors and they got hurt on ships, they would be abandoned. In the history of the Kingdom of Hawaii, there were laws related to maritime usage that were essentially predated the Jones Act and were exactly the same. They made sure that if a guy was out here on a ship that was catching whales and he broke his leg and they threw him overboard on Lahaina, that the state had a way to make sure that the ship owner would take care of their responsibilities towards seamen. For me, when you say Jones Act, my daily work has to do with the enforcement of the Jones Act, which are the right of seamen to have a cause of action against their employer if they get hurt because of the negligence of the employer.
Suppose there was no Jones Act, what would happen to your clients?
You can look right now, if you drive from Waikiki to the airport, you'll look at 100 fishing boats that when I came here 25 years ago.
You mean Kewalo Basin?
All of those fishing boats, and I don't mean the ones taking the tourists out, I mean the ones out there trying to catch fish for us to eat. It used to be those were American-owned, they were operated by Americans, and they were manned by Americans. Now there are these poor people who are mostly from the Philippines and Indonesia, and when they get hurt, they have no right to even go to the hospital here.
They don't have as workers' comp or anything
no,
like
they
that?
are sent because they're here on employment contracts back to the Philippines to try to fend for themselves. And you talk about getting rid of the Jones Act, well, that's what's going to happen to those people that are out there working on mats and ships, and maybe not at that level and degree, but that's the natural erosion. The Jones Act is one of the pillars that hold heaven above the waterfront. And
Okay.
You may think it's funny, and also your comment, it's all about votes. That's not true.
Okay.
This is all about protecting America, having a thriving business, and the people that are being protected, the companies we need to protect. Matson, Horizon, McCabe, Young Brothers, because without a healthy merchant marine, and that's what those people are, those are the people that are making sure that shipping works for America, and we are really dependent on that. And so it's not just an issue about who's the politician that'll raise a bumper sticker, get rid of the Jones Act, get rid of this, get rid of that. We have some of the most talented political people in America working here. Neil Abercrombie, for example, worked in Congress for a long, long time.
He was very supportive,
He
wasn't he?
really understands this issue. He spent his career helping out those people. Now, it's kind of in vogue to knock unions for this reason or that reason. Those people are unionized, but that's not the issue. The issue is that they should be protected, and we need to guarantee those jobs. We all know what happens when there's a strike on the waterfront and shipping doesn't take place. There's the famous time of no toilet paper, right? I think.
Oh, who could forget that?
Okay, well, the Jones Act.
That was
is
a real pain. Never mind.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm sort of like touting the horn, but I tell you that these are complex issues. You can't just get rid of the Jones Act and have America thrive.
Well, Mike, what do you say? Are you in agreement on this point? I'm not fomenting unrest here.
We're talking about apples and oranges here. Basically, what Jay is referring to is a different section of the Jones Act. He's referring to the part of the Jones Act that was modeled after the Federal Workers Act of 1908 that allowed
railroad workers to have a way to recover against
Exactly.
So
very
parallel to that, then.
Right, and that part of the Jones Act was modeled after that particular statute, and it was very progressive at the time because it gave the worker the ability to get redress from the employer.
There was no workers' comp at the time.
No, exactly.
Today, sailors, seamen are excluded from workers' comp.
Yes, but they're not excluded from workers' comp because the system wants them excluded from workers' comp. They are excluded from workers' comp because they have chosen not to be. They have chosen not to be part of workers' comp, and the plaintiff's bar has wholeheartedly supported that because it is a source of income.
Well, let me ask you,
That
just to put it in
kind of
perspective, you
cynicism
guys.
is not healthy, and it is in fact mistaken.
I don't think
Let
so.
me just get one thing straight, and that is, if I am, say, an injured person, injured seaman or railroad worker or person, okay, would I be better off under the Jones Act, the Workers Act that you mentioned, Mike, or under workers' comp?
Okay,
Which will treat me better?
Here's the situation. The Jones Act allows you to go into a state or federal court and seek a redress for the negligence. You also have a right to unseaworthiness, which was created by the courts as a remedy because sailors before the Jones Act had no right to anything but maintenance and cure, which is basically your medical care
bills,
and
yeah.
a few dollars a day. It used to be down to $8 a day. Nobody can live on that. That's the Jones Act remedy. You have a federal workers' comp program called the Longshore Harbor Worker Compensation Act, which is only for people who work for maritime employers, and they're a maritime employee if they're loading, unloading, and repairing ships. Those are primarily the people that I help out. There is also a state workers' comp program that covers workers, but it excludes people covered under the Longshore Act, and it excludes people who are masters and members of the crew. Now, when you say, is it better, which one is better? It's kind of like it'll take on a case-by-case level. If you are injured and it's not because of the negligence of somebody else, you're better off in a workers' comp system. Here's what I make my clients say, and you can ask any of them when they come into my office. Workman's comp does not pay for pain and suffering. So you get a small...
Can you repeat that, Mike?
Yeah.
Excuse me?
Workman's comp does not pay for pain and suffering.
Write it down.
Okay, but you in a workers' comp situation, you do not have to prove that your employer was negligent. All you have to prove is that you were injured at work, and how much money you get paid at work. You get a small portion of that.
I think we have talked about.
Basically, what I've been talking about is not that part of the Jones Act. I've been talking about a separate part, Section 27 of the Jones Act, which refers to cabotage.
Let's go to that.
Yeah,
Let's go to
That's the part that has a greater effect.
Jay is referring to the section that deals with workmen's compensation.
Yeah.
The rights of seamen.
The rights of seamen,
Yeah.
And those are two separate pieces.
They're important, but I think for the discussion of how the Jones Act affects the economy, and I won't say that the personal injury aspect has some effect on the economy, but not nearly as much as the, call it, cabotage aspects of the act.
Right.
So, the question I would ask you is, so we had this act. It was for whatever political reasons existed in 1920. It was enacted by Congress, okay, and it's still here, still with us.
Right.
Essentially, all those points that we mentioned before has to be owned. The sailors have to be American. The ship has to have an American hull and be documented in the United States. Those things are still pretty much in place.
It also must be repaired in the United States. The overall purpose of those parts of the Jones Act is to ensure a healthy and prosperous merchant marine shipbuilding industry, repair industry.
Right, good point. And, this
But
comes to mind.
It hasn't been successful at doing that, but anyway. That's
Well, if you don't have any repair yards, it doesn't work
the thing is that it's not really repair, it's reconstruction of a ship.
Well, you remember the Vartsila case? It was the SS Monterey, I think it was.
Oh, yeah, it was
back
a
in the
mess,
turn
yeah.
of the 90s. And it was, quote, there was reconstruction done in the state shipyard in Finland.
Right.
Vartsila was the name of the state.
Right.
And they cut it in half and put a new section in. And then there was a big lawsuit about whether that was still an American hull.
It has to be under 10% by weight of steel.
And that was more than 10%. So ultimately, they lost their documentation.
Exactly.
They
lost their coastwise privileges, as they put it.
Pardon me.
Here's something else. Here's something else. The part of leaving out the Siemens rights thing. The part of this that we're trying to protect. You get a nation like Korea, which has a vibrant shipbuilding industry that is directly funded by its government. It's able to produce better ships at a cheaper price because its government is paying for those ships. Those ships want to come into our trade and move cargo for a lower and lower price. What happens is, when we no longer have American bottoms and American ships and American places to repair it and American workers, those ships, our American bottoms will be gone, and the price of cargo shipping will go up dramatically.
The price will not go up dramatically. That is just a canard. It's not going to happen. I'm not proposing that we should repeal the Jones Act. But
I love when the show gets hot like this. But actually, at this very moment in time, gentlemen, we are slated to take a short break. So this is KGU, ThinkTech 760 AM. We're talking about the Jones Act with Mike Hansen and Jay Friedham. And now we're going to take a short break. Stay right there. And when you come back, they'll both be standing or sitting, as the case may be.
Well, good. I hope you don't mind my vocalizing
No.
things, because this is, just really the way I look at the world. And I took classes in vessel documentation.
I wouldn't
and
expect
finance.
anything different from a Jones Act personal injury attorney.
You know something? I do almost no Jones Act cases.
Really?
Really. And let me tell you, I have other clients. Ron Moon, I was the lawyer for the change of the judiciary in Hawaii. I did a lot of work on that. I do other kinds of things. The idea that you disrespect me because you think that I'm an ambulance chaser at sea or whatever it is that's going on in your mind has nothing to do about this program.
Jay, easy,
well, no,
Jay.
I'm just letting you know, though. But that's really where I'm coming from. And the
We
majority of my
can
work
differ
is in
here. It's
yeah.
okay to differ, please.
Well, okay, but I don't need to sort of like take it and not say, hey, buddy, I don't really think that's the way it is. And it certainly isn't true of where I'm earning my living. Now, when I came here, I did a lot of Jones Act cases. Those cases are gone because the maritime industry in Hawaii has disappeared.
Sure.
And it's not just the 90 bottoms you're talking about. There's thousands of Jones Act bottoms, thousands of them that are not involved in shipping your goods that the people you represent are interested in. You follow me? Those are the Atlantis vessels, the guys who are taking tourists here and there. There used to be hundreds of those boats, and they're gone. And yeah. I
Okay.
should be talking
Well,
about-
in the next section,
what do you want to
I guess we didn't really. We should talk about the. We're going to talk about how things have changed since the Jones Act. I mean, it's a historical matter about the shipyards. We should throw in the amendments, whatever has been happening there. Your construction differential subsidy. We should definitely talk about that. And one of the things that floats with that is the pardon that reference. Is the notion of why did we take away the subsidy? Why don't we give the same benefits to ship owners as Korea gives to its shipbuilders?
The subsidies in Korea are not that great.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Well, we should talk about it because there's going to be pressure over the gas company issue. I'm pretty sure.
The basic problem is that we're no longer competitive in the shipbuilding industry. I'm not talking tugs and barges and small craft. I'm talking large
what do you do
ocean
about
going.
that?
Exactly. We're building fewer than 3 per year. For example, Japan turns out 200 per year.
3 in the country?
Yeah, a large ocean-going ships.
Well, we lost manufacturing to China. Why is this so surprising? It's just the way the country goes.
Yeah, but we've been in a decline of shipbuilding for.
Yeah, well, we're back. This is Jay Fidell, and we're talking about the Jones Act. What is it, and is it helping us? Here on ThinkTech on a Wednesday afternoon. Call it tech, if you will, because it has a huge impact, or at least arguably, we can discuss this, a large impact on the way Hawaii's economy works. So, Mike, would you go into that? What has happened since 1920, and how does that affect our state economy?
Since 1920, we've had Well, essentially, we need to go to World War II. We had a huge
This is
buildup.
going to be a long show.
We had a huge buildup in World War II of shipbuilding capacity and the ship and the fleet, the domestic, the U.S. built U.S. flag fleet. After World War II, essentially, it went into a very long decline. The lessons that Henry Kaiser and the other guys who were building
Well,
ships.
what about the 30s? So you were building for the war. You know, we were building all those carriers, thousands of them.
The 1930s was during the 1920s and 1930s. We had a very low level of maritime construction, ship construction. It wasn't until the later 30s that we started to construct ships in anticipation of World War II.
Okay. All right.
And the real big push came after Pearl Harbor, with Henry J. Kaiser and some of the other guys who pioneered the production line construction of large merchant ships.
And they made money.
And they made money. Yes, it was government programs, but they made money.
Well, let's talk about that. Somewhere in here, we got into this construction differential subsidy, which is something like what Jay's talking about in Korea.
No, it's a completely different thing.
for
What the construction differential subsidy program is that they had recognized after that there was a difference in the U.S. construction price we're talking about larger ships now, and what you could purchase a ship for in a foreign yard. At that time, most of the comparison was with European yards. And the U.S. government then paid the shipyard the difference between the U.S. build price and the foreign build price, so that we can continue to have rather large-scale ship construction in the United States.
So in what period did this exist?
I believe the program was started sometime in the 30s, and it was terminated in the mid-1980s.
So this was to encourage buyers, I guess, of ships,
Well,
owners of ships,
Yeah, it was
to
to
use
it was,
American
it-
shipyards.
It was to encourage the construction of ships in U.S. yards.
Yeah.
But these so-called CDS, Construction Differential Subsidy Program ships, CDS built ships,
Yeah.
were only entitled to trade in the international trade. They were not entitled to domestic trading privileges until the ship actually reached 20 years of age, and then it would be allowed into the Jones Act trade.
Well, I don't know exactly how that works, but would that ship be allowed to transit take freight or passengers between Honolulu and, say, L.A.?
No,
Only international.
only on the international.
Kind of limited then, huh?
Well, we had a very large international trade fleet at one time, and most of that came to an end in the 1990s.
Oh, that recent.
Yes.
And why? Was there some good reason for it to come to an end?
Well, there were a number of reasons. The termination of the construction differential subsidy program ended the U.S. construction of these ships. Many of these lines took foreign-built U.S. flagships, which they could operate in the foreign trade of the United States legally without contravening any laws. And there were some other technical issues regarding the tax treatment of income from shipping.
But like the Act itself, like the Jones Act itself, there were political reasons why the Jones Act was enacted. It may not have been the same reasons that we think about today, but there were political reasons. So who was advancing the notion of cutting off the construction differential subsidy for American shipyards?
Well, that was done because the cost of each of the differential subsidy was getting so high.
But who wanted it to be cut?
It was done by the Reagan administration.
So the administration came up with that idea.
Yes, I believe it was the administration.
So, but the bottom line is that to the extent that we have already, as you described, a trend, right, of a downhill trend of American shipbuilding, this accelerated the trend.
Absolutely. And we're down now to really a half a dozen major shipyards in the United States.
So, Jay, I mean, is there a good reason to have the Jones Act when we have really essentially no shipbuilding going on in the country?
Oh, absolutely. Let me tell you something he's not pointing out.
Okay.
The Jones Act doesn't only deal with the ships that go to New Orleans, but it deals with the ships that go up the Mississippi River and who operate on the inland waterways of America. You get some ship that's owned and operated by some foreign country that, perhaps it's, Captain Sheikh Seldom bin Laden, who's going up the United States internal waters, and we're dealing with national security issues. These are things that are extremely expensive to enforce. The Homeland Security presence on the waterfront has transformed America in this fashion. We are deeply concerned here in Hawaii that somebody's going to bring in a container some horrendously destructive device that could wipe out our economy and our people. These are issues that are also supported in their solution by the Jones Act. American-owned bottoms, American workers. And these are things that, I am very much for the protection of a healthy and vibrant economy for Hawaii.
Would you bring back the subsidy?
The subsidy, and I'm kind of a Reagan kind of guy. I mean, I don't think that government needs to be in there protecting and doing things for every business. This is not an infant industry situation. But I believe that the enforcement of the Jones Act, in fact, the strengthening of the Jones Act, will make a more vibrant shipbuilding industry, a more vibrant shipping industry.
But you don't have to be an economist to see that if we don't have enough American-built ships, okay, then our cost of shipping is going to be greater than it would be if we had a free market on ships. Isn't that true?
There's
Of course, and you can look at a free market in ships in different ways. What Jay's referring to is allowing foreign flag ships to trade domestically in the United States.
Understood.
And that's certainly one way of looking at it. And he's talking about it on the inland waterways.
Yes.
I don't know anybody that's ever proposed that except somebody who's really off in left field.
But you know that Jay's point exists the same way on the contiguous on the coasts.
Yes, but
there's no difference.
Yeah, but see, the thing is that in the build issue, that's a different issue. That is the build issue is one where we're saying that we have an absolute ban on merchandise importation of the United States. The merchandise in this case being a ship. Now, for example, if we take an analogous situation with the U.S. airlines, there is such a thing as aviation cabotage. And it's a parallel sort of system to maritime cabotage. Now, airlines can import aircraft and use them domestically as long as the aircraft is registered in the United States and operated by U.S. people.
But it can be owned by a foreign carrier?
No. The difference in under the Jones Act, ownership of a U.S. flag vessel must be 75% citizen ownership.
Thank you.
On an aircraft, U.S. flag aircraft, it only has to be 50%. And this is where we start to look at what is cabotage versus super cabotage. And what Jay says is that he wants to reinforce our super cabotage and make it even more restrictive.
Well, now let me tell you, when I came here...
Let's see what he says.
Okay. When I came here, we had American Hawaii Cruises, which was operating some vessels that were exempted from the Jones Act, full of asbestos and stuff, but American Hawaii Cruises plied the waters around Hawaii. And because,
who owned them?
Well, they were owned by, initially, there was a fellow in China who owned them for a while. They were then owned by Zell, Howard Zell, who drove them into bankruptcy. But let me get my point across.
And fleeced the American taxpayer.
Yeah, but let me tell you about somebody who wasn't fleecing the American taxpayer, and that was Senator Inouye, who had the vision to construct a plan to be able to build American cruise lines vessels that had not been built in America in years in Pascagoula, Tennessee. But to do that, Pascagoula, Mississippi, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Trent Lott's home area. But
and it failed, and they had to take the pieces of the ships to Germany to finish them.
Okay.
It was
because the shipyard wasn't up to it.
Yeah,
no,
it was a complete failure.
Okay,
you're
mistaken about why it happened, and I'd like to get my point out before you decide to jump up and down about it.
I love this show.
All right. Senator Inouye set this thing up. It required it to be given essentially a cruise line monopoly to operate around the islands of Hawaii. And I was against it because monopolies, I thought that went out with Teddy Roosevelt. Well, it turned out they needed the monopoly to be able to get the banks to fund the building of those ships. Senator McCain came forward and scuttled that deal, and that's why it didn't go through. And it wasn't because of Inouye's insight and vision and efforts to put this together. We could have an American Hawaii cruise vessel, or 2 or 3 of them, operating around here, built in America at this time. And so the fact that it fell apart was because his Senate support disappeared and dried up, and the situation changed. But that's the kind of way of getting around the restraints of the Jones Act to make it work. And we're talking about the President Obama's ability to allow foreign bottoms to come in an emergency and to move this oil by non-American bottoms. There are safety valves. In times of crisis and national emergency, the president can step in and make slight modifications for short periods of time in the Jones Act to keep America healthy, and that's what's been going on.
You know,
here.
the thing in the Caribbean, in the Gulf, took place 2 years ago, maybe more. How come it took so long to get this worked out? It took a long time.
President Obama issued Jones Act waivers last year during the Libyan crisis. And President Bush had issued them prior to that during Hurricane.
Okay, so this started pretty early after the disaster.
The Jones Act can be flexible, and if it's used and applied in a way, it's not so restrictive.
Okay, well, that takes us to the question.
Waivers are only temporary. If we want an exemption, such as what Senator Inouye put in the law for passenger ships operating in the Hawaii trade, passenger ships now can be foreign-built U.S. flag, and which the one is, and operate in the Hawaii trade.
I'm all for that. I think that shows why the Jones Act really has the flexibility to allow for. It's like we don't need to end the Jones Act. We need to make slight amendments.
How about a proposal where we would exempt the non-contiguous trades from the U.S. build requirement of the Jones Act for large ocean-going ships?
Okay, well, that sounds great to the people at the Safeway, but how does it sound to Matson, to Mr. Dodds, who's trying to do...
Mr. Dodds wants a monopoly. That's why he doesn't want a free market in
Well, what
ships.
about
You know,
that?
I don't see that man that way you do. I see him as a guy who's taken control of a very important part of our economy, and he's trying to run it for the health and vibrance of our economy. And I don't see that he's asking for a monopoly. He just wants to run it.
Okay, well, the music is playing in the nick of time, I suppose. This is ThinkTech Hawaii on KGU 760 AM. We're talking about the Jones Act, and you can tell there's passion here. These guys are telling you how they really feel. I like that. Mike Hansen, Jay Friedham. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back with ThinkTech Hawaii.
Cool. Who'd have thought?
So we should go into the economy question. You know, because you have national security on question,
Okay.
and you help the sailors.
I'd like to say that the problem with what your proposal is that the companies that are going to be hurt the most are the ones that I mentioned before: Matson, Horizon.
Horizon Lines can't afford to build a ship right now.
Okay, I understand that. I'm
Just
just giving an
forget it.
example. I'm just giving you an example of the kind of companies that are going to be hurt by the relief that you're suggesting. And
The
Okay, but
problem-
forget the companies for a minute.
Okay.
I'm talking about, what do you call it, Safeway?
yeah, those
I
are the
wanna
people
know
standing
about
in line in the
Safeway.
Safeway, who are going to go, oh, wait, geez, my eggs are going to cost less money.
That's
Eggs
what-
is a great
that's what-
example.
Is that
'cause
true
Colleen,
or not true?
It turns out it's not true, but that's it's hard to prove it. We need an economist in here who's actually looked at it. There is a
It's not
slight
hard. It's not that hard to prove.
Okay, well, I'd like to discuss that. And then I'd like to discuss where, this is.
But see, it depends upon which Jones Act reform or change you're talking about. People talk about repeal the Jones Act. That's crazy because you're talking about a major regulatory system.
Let's talk about what kind of changes, according to you guys, if any, would be appropriate at this point now.
We are promoting right now the exemption.
Okay, we're going back. Okay, back to the fourth round of this show. KGU 760 AM. I'm Jay Fidell. It's ThinkTech. We're talking about the Jones Act. So we only have a few minutes left. Mike, what should we do here?
We at the Hawaii Shippers Council, and when we use the term shipper, we're meaning the people who are the cargo owners who tender their cargo for shipment on board carriers such as Matson, Horizon, etc. What we're proposing is that Hawaii, and the other non-contiguous jurisdictions, Alaska, Guam, and Puerto Rico, be exempted from the U.S. build requirement of the Jones Act for large ocean-going ships. And this would mean, for example, that companies like Horizon, who can't afford to replace their container ships now, could do so with foreign-built container ships, but they would have to flag them U.S., they'd have to be U.S. owned and U.S. crewed. That would be the same for the LNG trade if that develops. It would be the same, for example, if more crude oil is coming out of Alaska. One reason we're no longer receiving Alaska North Slope crude here is because it became too expensive to build Jones Act tankers to service that trade.
Okay, so it's a surgical, sort of exception that you're talking about.
A targeted,
would help Hawaii.
a
targeted exception.
Not just Hawaii, but the other non-contiguous jurisdictions.
But it would help us. Would
Yes.
help the others too. Jay, what do you think of that idea?
I think it's going to really cripple the remaining shipbuilding industry in America. I would go in exactly the opposite direction.
What would you do?
First of all, I agree with him that we need a quick fix, and I think a quick fix is in order. I would use American funds and American resources to revamp our shipbuilding industry, to again put us back on top of the world.
How would
in
you
this
do that?
By having direct contribution by the United States in the refurbishment of this industry.
Is that
Kinda
subsidies
like
or what?
bailouts, buddy. This is we're talking
Bailouts.
about.
I think you're
and
right. It has to be that way.
It's in the nature of that kind of a commitment, but the overall thing is not that it's going to pay all these people, bonuses and salaries. I'm talking about a real effort on the part of Congress and the leader of the United States to actually revitalize our industry and our repair yards. That would trickle down in Hawaii, because the Jones Act means that BAE, the other places that are fixing vessels here in America, continue to get those jobs and that work, and that industry be revitalized here. That's my view of the
Is that going to work, Mike?
No, it won't work. And the reason it won't work is because you have to be able to build ships for export in order to service, to maintain a large shipbuilding
You build a
base.
ship and sell a ship overseas somewhere.
Exactly.
The way the Koreans are doing.
And the Japanese and the Chinese. 90% of the world's shipping is now constructed in either China, South Korea, or Japan. Japan, for example, builds around 200 large ships per year, commercial ships per year.
Can we get up to that?
No.
Why can't we do that here in the U.S. of A?
To penetrate the market, to get your costs down low enough, to get your shipyards up to that kind of
Suppose we
performance.
throw government money at it.
Well, here, this is
If you
suppose the United
start
Wait, let me finish.
throwing government money at it, you're going to make a lot of shipyard owners rich, and there will be very little to show for it.
Comment?
I have another
Jay?
suggestion. Make the United States a buyer of American-built vessels. The United States buys those vessels, they lease them back to the American industry, and that we don't need to depend on selling it. We don't need to take all of the shipbuilding industry away. We need a market share.
No one country has a large enough demand for ships to do that. That's why you've had a concentration of shipbuilding in 3 countries. Because they've developed the expertise, the infrastructure to build those ships on a very efficient basis.
Okay, now put all of your suggestions aside and just tell me, honestly, what do you think is going to happen, in fact, on this question?
I think the ships in the Jones Act ships in the United States, the average age is approaching 40 years of age in the fleet. And they're just going to get older and more decrepit. At some point, there's going to be a gun at somebody's head to do something about it.
I have a very different view of the world. God willing, we will have the kind of leaders who have the experience in legislation and the vision in the economy to lead us into a situation in which we can again have a vibrant shipbuilding, ship repairing, sailors, the workers, everybody back on target. I don't see this as gloom and doom in the end of the earth. I'm looking for the person who's going to step up and say, I am going to make America viable again. And the shipbuilding industry is a good example of what we can do. And we have great people in place right now. Our incumbent politicians are vastly more experienced than we give them credit for. And it's just not popular to be able to go out there and say, hey, look, we have to stay the course. We have to make the kind of commitment to keep America strong.
You're both saying that we have to do something. So, and certainly I think that seems clear. But suppose I give you the the fact pattern where we do nothing. Suppose we do nothing. Suppose we let it stand the way it is right now. What happens? What happens to the country? What happens to Hawaii?
I think what happened in Guam in November last year, where Horizon discontinued service and Matson is now a monopoly operator in the Guam trade. And Matson has significantly increased their profits as a result of that. That's what's likely to happen in the non-contiguous trades.
What happens at Safeway?
Prices go up.
They're already up.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what I'm saying is it has secondary effect. Safeway doesn't happen in a vacuum.
That's right.
There's a certain marginal group of people.
All the goods that are purchased here, that are manufactured on the mainland, prices go up. And this is just the effects that you see on finished goods that arrive on container ships. There's a whole different set of problems for people like the cattlemen who need access to livestock carriers, the grain mill that needs access to bulk carriers, all these other issues that we haven't even touched upon.
Okay, well, we only have a minute or two left, but let's hear from you, Jay. What happens if we do nothing?
We have a current blip or a glitch in the economics of this. We're still going to be a vibrant America. The country is not going to go down. Matson is not ripping off Guam. These are fair trade issues. I believe that without it being, we have to do something. We need to continue to make progress. Progress means picking up the tools, building the ships, and keeping going with the plan. The plan is to protect America, to have a vibrant and resilient economy in Hawaii, and I believe that it's not only possible, but we're on our way to the cure already.
Why?
Because it works, because the ships are loading and unloading, because we have what we need. It might be, it arrives at the last moment.
If you have only a few carriers, and you don't have many carriers, then by definition, shipping rates will be higher, and they are higher. We know that as a matter of fact right now. If that trend continues, as a matter of status quo, because of the limited number of players in the market, what will happen to the Hawaii economy?
The reality is that things are costing more for a lot of reasons, besides for just the fact that they're shippers. The cost of the fuel to move the things back and forth, the cost of everywhere down the line. It's not just how much Safeway pays for those eggs, which I think have been shown to be, was a fluke. It really doesn't cost more for the eggs here that are grown here than on the mainland. But the Safeway needs to pay its employees. The McCabe needs to pay the workers that load and unload the ships. Matson needs to build new ships. That's why they need the profits.
Okay, Mike, we only have a minute left.
Matson and McCabe's workers are very well paid. They're some of the highest paid workers in the state.
Thank God for that.
Politically, we know the delegation likes the Jones Act. They stand behind the Jones Act.
That's right.
What's going to happen here?
Well, there's other non-contiguous delegations as well. And for example, the congressman from Puerto Rico, Perlusi, has asked the GAO for a study on the Jones Act, which is due at the beginning of next year, and he intends to introduce Jones Act reform legislation for the non-contiguous territories.
And I understand that Colleen Hanabusa is introducing modifications to the Jones Act. I don't know what they are. Do you?
No, she was on the Rick Hamada program the other morning, and she said that she's in full support of the Jones Act.
Yes, I think so, but she also indicated through her spokesman that there would be some changes. So I think that the issue is in play. There's much more to talk about. There's hours of discussion on this.
People should come tomorrow and actually attend our group if they have any interest in learning more about this.
You think it'll be different and better tomorrow?
Absolutely. We'll take the gloves off.
Mike, I seriously want you to come tomorrow. I told you that before. This is a great conversation. And in my view, people don't know enough about this. We have let the delegation, not only this delegation, but over the years, really since the 20s, take care of this because it's complicated. It involves issues extraneous to Hawaii. And the result is the average Joe doesn't know about the waterfront. He doesn't know about the Jones Act for the seamen. He doesn't know about the Jones Act for construction and maintenance of ships. And as a result, the public has been disconnected from this issue. And that's why ThinkTech and the Hawaii Venture Capital Association wanted to have this program tomorrow. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you guys tonight. We're happy that people are talking about it. We hope that ultimately people will get into it. Mike Hansen, the president of the Shippers Council, Jay Friedham, Admiralty attorney, both passionate, both so well informed. I am so impressed. The Jones Act. What is it and how is it helping us? Thank you, gentlemen.